First of all, if I can get away without using the mic, is that okay? What I do in a talk, the talk will last about 45 minutes to an hour. The first half hour I'll talk about what is an old book, first editions, signed books. I'll show off some of the things that I brought, tell a little bit of my history background, and tell a few stories, anecdotes of places I've been, people I've seen, and so on. And then what I like to do in the next 10 or 15 minutes is question and answer. And then, because I like to do question and answer, because I can go on and on and on with old books, and at least with question and answer I can go out on what you want to listen to. The last minute or two of the talk I will appraise one or two books to the audience in detail. After that, I'll end the formal part of the talk, but I'll stay. I'll answer any and all questions. I'll do any and all appraisals. I'll just do them a lot more quickly so we can get out of here tonight. I guess the first thing that comes up when you talk about old books is, what is an old book? And usually people mean by that, what's a valuable old book? Well, the first printed book was done in 1456, the Gutenberg Bible. If any of you have a Gutenberg Bible, let me assure you that it's valuable. Matter of fact, the last time one sold, half of it sold for $5.5 million. Single pages sell between $50,000 and $100,000 on average, and some even a little bit more. But any book printed in the 1400s has value. Some more than others, but anything in the 1400s is valuable. After that, though, it depends on what the book is. You can have a book printed in the 1500s that was a relatively dull and uninteresting book then, and it's still a relatively dull and an interesting book now, and nobody cares or will pay anything for it. On the other hand, you can have a relatively recent book. The first edition of the first Harry Potter book in London can sell for up to $80,000. So it's all what people are looking for and what they want. And I get loads of calls at the store, and people go, I have an old book, and I know it's an old book. And the way I know it's old is the pages are all brown and crumbling. And I point out that's more lousy paper than it is how old the book is. Now, this is a page from a book, and I'm going to pass this around. A lot of the things I show off tonight I won't pass around. They'll be up here afterwards. But you'll see it's not terribly fragile. The paper's white, the ink's black. And this is one of the first books done with illustrations. It was printed in the 1490s, so this page is a little over 500 years old. And you sort of say to yourself, well, gee, if they could make books like that then, why don't they do it now? Well, there was a big disadvantage to a book like that. First of all, in the 1490s, you had to be quite wealthy to get an education, to learn how to read. You had to be almost nobility to be able to afford to buy a book like that. Nowadays, maybe the books aren't quite as well made, but they're at a price that can be distributed in the millions. And the real value of books is the knowledge in the book and the dissemination of that knowledge, and I think it's a very good trade-off. Whenever you talk about book collecting, inevitably somebody will come up and say, I have a first edition. How much is it worth? And I point out that most first editions never came out in a second edition, probably never should have come out in a first edition. Nobody wants them, cares about them, or would pay anything whatsoever. A book has to be historically, scientifically, literarily, or for some other reason important that there are a group of collectors out there who want it. And usually when you think of first editions, you think of literature. Dickens, Twain, Faulkner, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and so on. And even within that, there are a lot of things that can make a big difference in the price. The condition being one of the most important. The paper dust jacket on a 20th century book can make all the difference in the world. My father had a copy of William Faulkner's second book called Mosquitoes. Absolutely pristine, as if someone took it from the publisher, sealed it away. At the time I got it, my father had it, he sold it within a week for $750. At the exact same time, another book dealer had the same book, Mosquitoes Faulkner, first edition, but it didn't have the paper jacket, had a few tiny little nicks and bumps, nothing terrible. It took them a year to sell it at $40. Because a lot of collecting is prestige. It's made me say, look what I have. I have the best. I have the most wonderful. Essentially, I have what you don't have, and people who can afford it will pay absolute top price for the very, very best, but might not consider spending anything at all for something slightly less. Other things that can affect the value, signed by the author. Well, once again, if the author's unknown, unheard of, the fact that it's signed doesn't mean that much. Maybe one of your relatives wrote a book of poetry, had 50 copies, signed it, gave it to family members. It might mean an awful lot to your family, but it doesn't add much to the price. On the other hand, if it's signed by someone famous, that can add hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to value. Maybe Ernest Hemingway signed a book. That, again, that will add thousands of dollars. In almost any type of collecting that you get into, there are nuances that can add or subtract to the value, and I use signed books to show that off. There are some authors that are almost impossible to get their signature. J.D. Salinger, for instance, who wrote Catcher in the Rye. He was reclusive, he lived up in New Hampshire, and other than to a close personal friend, absolutely would not sign a book. Thus, his signature adds thousands of dollars to the value because you just can't get them. On the other hand, there was a local author that maybe some of you knew, maybe you have his books, wrote wonderful go-see pirate buried treasure stories of the New England coast, Edward Rose Snow. Now, Snow was a friend of my father, and I knew him. And I remember one day he came into our shop, and he had said he had just been on Cape Cod, and he had gone into a bookstore, and Snow went right up to the section where his books were, pulled one off the shelf, opened it up, and exclaimed, "My, a rare, unsigned copy." And then he took out a pen and signed it, and then he introduced himself to the owner of the shop. So books signed by Edward Rose Snow don't add as much to the value. My father had a copy of F. Scott Fitzgerald's classic, The Great Gatsby. Now, just opposite what I was saying before, it was a first edition, but it didn't have a dust jacket. It was well worn and read, but when you opened it up, on the front end paper was inscribed, "To the greatest living poet, T.S. Eliot, sincerely F. Scott Fitzgerald." Now, in addition to that inscription, when T.S. Eliot read it, he made marginal notes, annotations, comments, crossed things out, added things into just about every page of the book. That book now would be worth $200,000, $300,000, maybe even $400,000 because of the association. One last story about signed books. There was an autograph and manuscript dealer in Massachusetts. He was actually one of the most prominent in the world. But when he was a young boy, he used to collect books by Robert Frost. And he knew Robert Frost. And when he was 13 years old, he went to London and he bought a copy of Frost's first book called A Boy's Will. Very complicated, what really is the first edition. He paid a lot of money for it at the time, came back to Boston. A few weeks later, he met with Frost. He was very proud of himself. He said, "Look what I've got." And Frost looked at it and said, "What did you pay for it?" And he told him. He said, "Give me the book." So Frost took it and in the front two end papers wrote a 2-page description of how to tell the first binding from the second binding, from the third binding, from the fourth, how they changed bindings, why they changed bindings, the different colors of the bindings, on and on and on for 2 pages, signed it, closed the book, handed it back to the boy and said, "Now it's worth what you paid for it." In any case, let me digress a little, give you a little bit of my background and the history of the store. The history of the Brattle Bookshop goes back to the 1820s, but for all practical purposes, it was going out of business in 1949. My father was getting married, my mother had $500, and with that $500, they bought half interest in the store. And it's always been in Boston. People call us from Harvard Square on Brattle Street all the time saying, "Where are you?" We tell them we're in downtown. When my parents first bought the store, there was a little side street in what was Scully Square called Brattle Street. To make it even more confusing, the street doesn't even exist anymore. It's where Boston City Hall Plaza is now. And my father built the store on his great love of books, his hard work, his knowledge, and he was also a bit of a character and a showman. And we've had 7 different locations over the years, mainly due to urban renewal. And every time we'd move, when it was planned move, my father would move the best books to the new location. Then he'd run sales, half price, dollar, 50-cent, quarter, dime. And the last day of the sale, he would, everything was free. And he would literally have hundreds of people line up with bags, packs, satchels, whatever. He'd ring a big bell. They'd go charging into the store, grab whatever they could grab. 5 minutes later, he'd ring the bell again. That group would leave. The next group would come in. And he gave away over 250,000 books that way. Now, the last time he did this was in 1969. And we're moving from the end of Washington Street to West Street where we are now. And at the end of the giveaway, there were books left over. And like I said, my father was a bit of a character and a showman. And if you can sort of picture this, he hired a covered wagon with a cowboy and a horse team. And on the cover of the covered wagon, it said, "Go West, book lovers, go 5 West Street, Brattle Bookshop." They filled it up with books and they drove it from the end of Washington Street near Boston City Hall, up Court Street, down Tremont by the Boston Common to where West Street is, and then back down Washington Street with my father sitting in back, throwing books out the whole way. Now, the superintendent in charge of traffic told him he could do it all morning, but within an hour, the city was in an absolute standstill. They told him to stop. He didn't care. He'd gotten his point across, and we've been on West Street since then. When we first moved in, we were in a 5-story, 150-year-old wooden building, absolutely crammed full of books. And in February of 1980, I got a call at 4 o'clock in the morning. The building was on fire, and it literally burnt to the ground. I mean, it was 100% gone. But we wanted to continue to keep going, not go out of business. We found a storefront a few doors up the street. We rented folding tables. People either sold, gave us, donated books. Kevin White, who was the mayor at the time, came down with a carload of books. And even though it was a meager stock, within a month we reopened. Again, the main thing was just keep going. Over the next 4 years, we slowly but surely rebuilt the stock. 4 years after that, we bought the building we're in now, which is again on West Street. And it's sort of the old Dickensian type of store. Outside stands at $1, 3 and 5, 2 floors of general used books, and then a 3rd floor with rare books, autographs, manuscripts, first editions, leather bindings, and so on. And that type of store is a dying business. Especially in the inner cities. And it's not dying because people don't like books, buy books, read books, sell books, but in the inner cities, property value has gone so high, that rent has gone so high, that old bookstores, which I assure you are not the most efficiently run businesses in the world, one right after the other have been going out of business. And in the last few years, the internet has just speeded that process along. Now, like I say, we bought our building in the early 80s, so I hope to do this for years to come. I have daughters who are there in their early 30s. I don't think they have any interest in coming into it the way I did. And I've done this all my life. My parents say my first word was book. I don't know, maybe it was. I'm sure they were talking about them all the time. And then I worked after school in elementary school, junior high school, summers during college. I have a degree in chemistry from the University of Massachusetts. I was going to get a doctoral degree at the University of Wisconsin, but in 1973 I needed a year off. My father's health wasn't that good. That year now has been over 40 years, and I don't regret for a minute that I'm doing this and not in a laboratory somewhere. Now, one thing, I'll just bring in a little local thing. I remember my father and I used to come out to Rockport every once in a while. My father had a couple of friends. One was a Mr. Perkio, who was the police chief out here for a long time. And then another was a writer, journalist named John Kieran, who my father was very friendly with. And Ann Ford, who was a public relations director for Houghton Mifflin and so on. So there was a lot of connections that we used to come out, and friends and literary connections, but that's what Rockport's about in many cases. If you would ask me, what's one item that I wish I could find? It's a little pamphlet here called Tamerlane by a Bostonian. It was done in 1827. It doesn't look like very much, but the Bostonian who did this was Edgar Allan Poe. It's a classic rarity in American literature. The first copy to ever really show up and be found was in the 1890s in the Boston book dealer's 10-cent table. Another book dealer spotted it there, bought a stack of books so it wouldn't stand out, and then in 1890 sold it for $1,000. Then in the 1950s, there were two postmen in the New Bedford area who on the side were book scouts. Being postmen, they knew where all the yard sales were. They bought a trunk of books. Bottom of the trunk was a Tamerlane. Families got involved. They got to negotiating. And after 6 months, they sold it for $10,000. Now, I don't know if it was worth it because they started out best of friends. By the time they sold it, they never spoke again. But they got their $10,000. And then about 20 years ago, there was an antique dealer in the Newburyport area who died, and his whole estate was auctioned. Paintings, prints, furniture, antiques, books as a group, $600 to an antique dealer in New Hampshire. They took all the pamphlets, put them in a box, $15 each, and about 20 years ago sold it for $198,000. And one sold a couple of years ago for $800,000. And let me just say, this is a facsimile. A lot of what I bring with me are original, but I don't bring million-dollar pamphlets. But if any of you want to come take a close look and then go home and check your attic, cellars, basements, whatever, if you find one, please give me a call. I'd love to hear about it. A lot of the fun of collecting is learning about something, is studying it, is appreciating it. It's really your knowledge that makes something interesting and thus valuable. Somebody might look at something and say, oh, that's a scrap of paper. Someone else might say, that's a broadside that led to the Boston Tea Party, that led to the American Revolution, that led to our country's independence. So it's really that knowledge and understanding that makes something interesting and thus valuable. Now, here's an item that I think on the surface is interesting, but the story behind it maybe even more so. This is on White House stationery. It's dated April 11th, 1933, and it starts, Dear Jim, I want to send you this note to tell you how happy I am that you are to represent the United States in Poland. It's a most important post, etc., signed always sincerely, Franklin Roosevelt, and it's to the Honorable James Michael Curley, Mayor of Boston. Now, on the surface, this seems like a great honor. It's an ambassadorial appointment. Well, Curley didn't think it was such an honor. Matter of fact, I think he thought Roosevelt was trying to get rid of him, which of course he probably was. And Curley's response to Roosevelt was, remember, this was 1933. He said, in Poland, with Germany on one side, Russia on the other, you should send your worst Republican enemy to Poland. He said, matter of fact, if you think it's so important, why don't you quit and go there yourself? Now, Curley's opinion of Washington didn't change over the years. We also have a number of letters that he sent to his wife when he was in Danbury prison. Now, even though these were personal letters, he was still very much the politician. And there was one quote I particularly loved. He had just gotten into prison and he wrote to his wife and he said, many of the four-legged creatures in my cell have more honor than the two-legged creatures in Washington. In any case, enough for Curley. A lot of the things we get are not just books, but pamphlets, brochures, programs. Here's a program from the 1912 World Series. The Red Sox played the Giants in 1912, won the World Series, won a few more times up through 1918, and then we had to wait a long time. But not only is it interesting as a baseball item, but on the back there's an ad for Arrow shirts and collars. Collars are $1.50 and $2, and shirts the same. So, or the collars are 25 cents. The shirts are $1.50. I also have a brochure here for a ship. Tells you how wonderfully built, where to book passage. Now people go on cruises all the time, and anyone who wants to go on the Titanic, this is a brochure for it. And almost anything you can think of, there are people out there who are interested. There are whole societies of Titanic historians who do nothing but study the Titanic. There's also a tendency when you talk about collecting. I mean, I do books and autographs and manuscripts and so on, but all of a sudden, things were worth thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars. And I like to always point out that not everything has to be high priced to be fun. Old Life magazines, for instance. Here's one with Errol Flynn on the cover. Another with Elizabeth Taylor when she was 15 years old. And these sell for a relatively few dollars. You can get them very easily. There are a few exceptions that go higher, but a couple of dollars, most of them. And we used to have a wall at the store by a stairway where we'd have a couple of hundred of the more famous lives hanging up. And people would sometimes stop and stare at that wall for a half an hour, even an hour at a time, lost in thought and memory. They loved them for the stories, the articles, the photographs. They made wonderful birthday or anniversary presents if you fell on the right dates. And we had a regular customer come in, and he bought about 50 Life magazines from World War II, and it wasn't what he normally bought. So I said to him, "Why are you buying these?" And he said, "Well, I want to teach my children about World War II," and he thought a nice way to do it would be to get some of the old Lives, look at a few of the pictures, read an article or two, and then discuss it with his kids. Sounded like a good idea to me, but I was skeptical. He came in a couple of weeks later and I said, "How's it going with the Lives?" He said, "Fabulously," but not the way I thought. He says the kids don't care about the stories, the articles, the photographs, but they love the ads. And he says, and it turns out by looking at and discussing the ads with them, he could probably teach them more about what the United States was like during World War II than if they had read everything else anyways. I have other things here of a cookbook from the 1700s. Some of the recipes are wonderful. And then you have How to Bake Eels the Common Way. Now, I don't know if I want to bake them anyway, but that's beside the point. One of the most interesting parts about the business for me is going out to houses and estates. That's how we get most of our books. And it's almost like being Jim Hawkins on Treasure Island every day, never knowing who you're going to meet, the people, the places, the books. And I'll relate a few of those stories to you, and then after that maybe see about some questions. This was a number of years ago. I was out of the store, and there was a message when I got back that a Mrs. Fisher had called and had some books. I called her up, and she said, "Oh yes, my father died in Providence. He has 500 art reference books. We want to get the best price we can. We're inviting a number of dealers down to bid on them. Would you be interested?" Well, 500 art reference books sounded like a good library. Providence is only an hour from Boston. They lived on an old street up near Brown University called Benefit Street. I got to the house. It was a large old colonial house. I got led through the house into a courtyard, into a garage. Second floor of the garage, they had 5,000 books. Well, it turned out her married name was Fisher. Her father's name was John Nicholas Brown. Their family founded Brown University, one of the wealthier families in the country. And after about 8 months, I bought about 90% of the books I wanted. I was happy. She was happy. And she said, "My mother has a lot of books. Most are being given to the university. Some are being sold at auction, but would you like to go to Newport to take a look at the books there?" Well, their house in Newport is one of the mansions on the ocean. I mentioned this to my wife. She decided to come with me on this deal. And one of the fascinating parts about it was being in one of those mansions that was still being lived in by a family. And at one point, wandering from the basement to the attic, all on my own, without a tour guide saying, "Come here, go here, don't touch this," but literally just wandering through the whole place. It was fascinating. Another time I got called to Newport to do an appraisal. Now when I come to groups like this, I do hundreds of free appraisals. I have my card, we have 800 numbers, we have websites, pictures, whatever. And my goal is that whenever anyone thinks of an old book, you think of me and the Brattle Bookshop. I don't care if you think of 10 others, just as long as we're one of the 10. And one of the ways I feel I can do that is by giving out as much free information as reasonably possible. But there are times when people ask for very formal, written appraisals for insurance, estate taxes, whatever, then I discuss a fee. In any case, I got called to another mansion in Newport, not quite as big as the Browns. This was the Perry family. Commodore Perry, Oliver Hazard Perry, and what they had was a whole stack of papers from the War of 1812. During the war, their family were privateers. Well, they're privateers if you're on our side. They're pirates if you're on the other side. It's all the way you look at it. But it was the day-to-day accountings of the ships. And they would sometimes capture a ship and realize tens of thousands of dollars profit. In 1812, that was an incredible amount of money. Then one day, one of the ships got into a battle. The ship got hit. The captain got hit. He lost his leg. 3 days later, there was a tiny entry at the bottom of a page, and it said, "Captain, $5 bonus, loss of leg." And that was the last you heard of the captain. So it's a little different nowadays. When my father was still alive, and he died over 35 years ago, we got a call from a lady. She was very vague about her name, who she was, what she had, but it sounded like she might have a few interesting books. She lived in Sharon, so it was close by. We went to her house, got to the house, and it was a little ranch house. Paint was peeling, weeds were growing, and you sort of say, oh, gee, what's going to be here? She answered the door. She was quite elderly. We walk in, and there were just gorgeous antiques everywhere. I mean, really, really beautiful antiques. And she got to talking. It turned out she was originally from the Boston area, but she had married the Prince of the Ukraine, the cousin of the Tsar of Russia. He had escaped just before the revolution. And she told story after story about being Russian nobility in Europe and all the court intrigues and all the goings-on. How T.E. Shaw used to stay at her house all the time. How she didn't think he accidentally died on a motorcycle. T.E. Shaw, of course, was Lawrence of Arabia. And she went on and on and on with these wonderful stories. Turned out her books were lousy, but the stories were absolutely wonderful. And when we first got into her house, there were 10 watercolors about this size, pastoral European scenes. And when I first saw them, I thought they were nice. And the more she talked and the more stories she told and the longer we were there and the more I looked at them, the nicer I thought they were. And I finally said to her, those 10 watercolors, they're really nice. And she sort of turned around and said, oh yes, they're all Turners. So she had 10 original Turner, probably $1 million worth of them. And it was like, yeah, they're just Turners. So you never know what you're going to see, the people, the places, the characters. As a matter of fact, speaking of characters, about 15 years ago, we went to one of our customers' 100th birthday parties. Now, when you go to a man's 100th birthday party, and he tells you he just got back from Barcelona, he's going to give a talk in Florida, and he's been asked to lecture in Tokyo. And I finally said to him, wait a minute, you're 100 years old. Don't you think Tokyo is an awfully long way to go? He said, well, when I used to work, it took me well over 25 hours to get to Chicago. He says, I don't think Tokyo's a whole lot further than that nowadays. And here's a man who could tell you about one day sitting down to dinner with Henry Ford and Thomas Edison. And he said he was really looking forward to this dinner and all the learning and insight he was going to get from these two men. And he said he was actually excited, and he got to the table a little bit early. He said 5 minutes later, Ford came in and sat down next to him. And about 15 minutes later, Edison came in. Now, Edison was quite elderly, had one of those big horns for hearing, and sat down opposite them. And he said the first thing, Ford turned to Edison and yelled, "My Tom, you look very good." And Edison turned to Ford and yelled, "It's the Carter's little liver pills." This man said all night long, all they did was yell about Carter's little liver pills. And he said next time he wanted to learn something, he went to the library. Now, I can go on and on and on with these stories. I'll tell one more, and then we'll see about some questions. We get hundreds of phone calls at the store, people wanting to know, do you have a book? Can you get a book? How hard is it to get the book? Does the book exist? Or what's the value? How much is it worth? And so on. Most of those questions, I or the people I work with, we can answer right off the top of our heads. Some are a little more, every once in a while you really have to do some work and research, but that can be fun. But every once in a while you get a call that really stands out. And again, a while ago, but I answered the phone. Hello, Brattle Bookshop, can I help you? A lady, elderly, very thick Irish brogue, and the first thing she says is, President Kennedy slept with me. Now, you have to admit that gets your attention. And she stopped and waited for it to sink in. And then she went on to explain that she had worked for the Kennedy family. She had been his nursemaid. When he was 3 and 4 years old, he used to fall asleep in her arms. So he did sleep with her, but maybe not quite what you first think. And what she had was a whole series of handwritten letters from the president. She wanted to get an offer on them. I was skeptical about that, but I thought she'd be fun to meet. I went to her house. Great stories. The letters were fabulous. I gave her what I thought was a tremendous offer, but much as I suspected, there was no way she could sell these letters. Letters were part of her life. I left a note behind. As far as I know, her family still has them, probably where they belong. Who knows, maybe someday I'll hear about them again. Like I say, I can go on, but why don't I see if there are some questions? Quite honestly, anything you ask me, I can go off on a tangent. But does anyone have any questions? Yes, no? Yes?
I was talking to a local bookseller recently, and he kind of seemed very pessimistic about the future of rare book selling. That he said people just really aren't interested in buying books any longer. Could you just talk a little bit about your feelings about that?
Well, the question is, talking to a bookseller saying they're not sure that people are going to be interested in books, and what's the future of it. Like I say, I think the biggest problem, at least for used booksellers, is the property, the overhead, and that. Not as much that people aren't interested. Now, there are a lot of things that changed. Matter of fact, I think last Monday or Tuesday, the Boston Globe didn't write about used bookstores, but they wrote a whole story about how there's a surge in smaller independent bookstores that are coming back. In other words, a lot of them closed when Barnes & Noble Border came in, then Borders are getting pushed out by Amazon. But now the local store that can give personal service, have author signings, talks. No, I think books are still selling very well. The other thing, but there are some tremendous changes. First of all, the internet, as much as anything else. If you're buying a book because you just need the information, I mean, how many people have bought an encyclopedia recently, or a dictionary, or anything, even art books, antique books, reference books, anything that you're buying just because you want the information? A lot of those aren't selling well because it's on the internet. I had a friend, or I have a friend, I should say, I didn't have, and he came in the other day. He's retired, and he thought he'd take up tennis. And he said, "Do you have any any books on how to play tennis?" Well, it turned out we didn't. But he said, actually YouTube's better anyways, because you can actually see the people, the strokes, and so the pure reference people don't need. The other thing that's happened, you sort of picture the old professor, a scholar, woman, or man sitting in their study surrounded with books so that they can reach up and at any time pull out that little fact. Well, again, you can just Google it now, so you don't need that big library. A lot of people now, too, when you go into a used bookstore, 20 years ago, you saw a book on the store and you said, gee, I'm going to need that book a year or two from now. Even if it's a little high, I'm going to buy it because when I need it, I'm not going to be able to get it easily. Now you go click, click, 100 copies of that same book show up, the prices come way down, but then you'll say to yourself, well, I don't need to buy this until I need it, which in most cases means you never buy it because you never end up needing it. So all of that has affected it, but people still like books. They still read books. They still come into the stores. They still like the shopping, the experience of shopping. The other thing that happens that I point out to a lot of people, if you know exactly the book you want, yeah, Amazon is great or online is great. But if you come into a bookstore and you're looking for a subject, you might find the book you want, but realize the book that you had never heard about, never knew anything about, is on the shelf next to it. The same with open stacks of a library. And you find something that you didn't know existed. And that can be as important or more important. Also, there's a very social aspect of collecting. So people are still collecting, they're still reading, and the tactile feel of reading a book. And, you know, if the power goes out, you can still read a book. And quite honestly, I don't like taking a Kindle or an iPad to the beach. I much prefer to read it. You have a question?
Yeah, just to add on to that, you don't want to curl up with a laptop while you're reading a good book.
Well, the question is...
That's not my question.
Okay.
I just thought, you know, do you find, and you do rare books, you said, right?
Yeah.
Do you find international sales better than American?
Well, the question is, on rare books, are the sales international better than American? It all depends on the book. Buyers and so on. It all depends on the books. There are some books are still locally, you know, that people want them in certain particular areas, and there are more. But it's gotten spread out tremendously, and that's also changes. 20 years, the Japanese were buying everything they could get their hands on. The economy there went down. And Chinese now are buying anything that's China or China related. So that varies and changes, but people collecting interests always change, particular authors change, sort of types of collecting change, but people still like buying books, having collections. People still like hunting and gathering. And quite honestly, one of the great things about having collections, whether it's books or anything, is the hunt. It's being able to look, to be able to go to every library sale, book sale, yard sale, bookstore, auction, in the hunt. And matter of fact, one of the things that I've seen happen, sometimes a collector is looking for a book for years and years and years, and they find it. And it's almost disappointing because they don't have that book to look for anymore. Although I can almost assure you that anybody who is that obsessive that they've been looking for have other things they're looking for. I one time bought a whole large collection of cookbooks. Older books, nicer books, used cookbooks, but it was a big collection. But they also had about 2 boxes full of those little pamphlets, like how to make Jell-O, how to use a mixer, how to cook, how to use a refrigerator, the old way. I mean, anyways, there was 2 boxes of that, and some of them were very nice, but it just wasn't worth the time. And we just decided we're going to put them out on our dollar table. If people get bargains, great, but we'll sell them. About 2 hours later, a customer comes running in, a man, and he had one, and he going, I've been looking for this for years and years, and he was just beside himself and thrilled, and it's only $1, and I look at the book, and the title is Coconuts and Constipation. and you know, and so you never know. In any case, yes, in the back there.
How do you think the internet, is it worthwhile to research books on there, and do you think sites like Alibris and what's the other one, A-Books, are they priced accurate?
Well, the question is, when you're doing research on the internet, you're talking about books and specifically, but this could apply to almost any type of research you do on the internet. And then some of the sites, there's ABE Books, there's a number of other sites that have used and rare books on them. How accurate, how good are they? The way I almost liken that is it's a tool. And if you know how to use the tool, it can be incredibly helpful. But on the other hand, I mean, I know how to some idea with those, but quite honestly, if a cabinet maker has all their tools, they can use those tools and make gorgeous cabinets. I might take those same tools and end up having a swollen thumb because I've hit it with a hammer. And almost in the same way, you can look things up on the internet, and if you have no idea what you're looking at or how it got there or what the background is, you might have no idea. And also the internet, when you're doing any type of research, and again, this applies to books too, it's unedited. Nobody is saying to anybody that you can or can't. So some of it's very good, very accurate, and some of it is completely inaccurate, and some of it you might have people who are actually trying to deceive you, but I actually find that's a small number. But you might order things and it's not what you expected. It really wasn't the person trying to deceive you. They had no idea what they were looking for. Another thing that happens on pricing on the internet is some of the people who do internet pricing on a huge scale, actually computers do all the pricing, and they consider an old book, any book before ISBN numbers, which was in the 70s, the barcodes. Because before that, they can't have a computer program take it. And then what will happen is, but all of those books, a computer will go online, check, and if there isn't another copy, it might price it at thousands of dollars. Even though there might be not another copy because it was such a horrible book that nobody wants it. But then every hour, that computer will check the internet again and reprice and reprice and reprice and reprice and so on and so forth. So you got to be careful. Now, the one thing I tell people, though, when you're looking up books on your own, is the first thing to look up, before you even look at price, is look at how many. Because if you go online and it's a book you're looking for and there are 100 copies, what that's essentially telling you immediately, there are 100 copies that haven't sold. At whatever price they have it doesn't make any difference. Those 100 copies haven't sold. And you don't sort of go, if you find average described about the same, you don't take the average, because let's say the price is on an average copy $10 to $100. If you're buying it, you're not going to say, oh, well, it's 10 to 100, I'll buy the $50 one. No, it brings it down to the lowest common denominator. The other thing that I also suggest is if you have large lists of books, bring them to me, bring them to another book dealer that you know and have some confidence in. And at least I can go through that list and say, well, if you really want to check this one, this one, this one, this one, and maybe I can narrow that list from 100 to 5 or 10. And then if you want to double check, you're not sure you're getting accurate information, at least you've narrowed it down. And nowadays, what I tell people when they call us a lot of times and want to know a general thing, writing a list, if you have a library of 300, 400, 500 books, writing a list of 300, 400, 500 books is a big job. But if they're on shelves and you take a few digital pictures, you can sometimes get 50, 75 books in one picture. And if they're in focus and we can see the spines, we can tell you almost immediately whether it's a library well worth looking, well not worth looking, looks like junk, or we can say the third book on the bottom shelf from the right-hand side, you need more information on that one. So there's a lot of ways you can do it, and again, it's a tool. I'll tell you what, at this point, why don't I do one or two appraisals to the audience. Did anyone bring a Bible? Did anyone bring a Victorian cloth book with a very decorative illustrated cover? And the reason I'm asking for these has nothing to do with price. It has more to do with they lead to stories. And quite honestly, if nobody did, I'm going to tell the stories anyways. But
I have one from 1897.
it does have a pretty cover on it?
Yeah, sort of.
Well, let me see what it...
It's one that came in as a donation for the Friends of the
Well,
Library book sale. So it's not my book.
That's all right. All right, well, this is sort of in between, but it will do for the purposes. And also just in case nobody had brought one, I just happen to have one to show off. Let me first say something about appraising. When I do appraisals at a group like this, I give a retail price. In other words, the price that you would pay if you came into my store or a store like mine. It is not what you would get if you're selling the books. If you're selling the books, usually you should expect to get about 1/3 to 2/3 of the retail value. When you're dealing with the really low-end the markup might even be a little bit more, just because you have to make some money. When you get to the much higher end, the percentages can come down. For instance, a number of years ago, I bought a copy of Audubon's Quadrupeds, not the birds, but the animals, but the big, huge, with 150-something hand-colored plates. At the time, I paid $100,000 for it. I sold it within 2 weeks for $105,000. That's only a 5% markup, but it's $5,000, well worth the time and effort I spent, and I pretty much had it pre-sold before I even bought it. So when you're going to turn something over quickly, especially the higher priced items, percentages can come down. Also, everything I say is subjective. So the fact that I say something's worth $100 doesn't mean a colleague of mine might not say $125 and another colleague say $75. So if you know what you have, you get a price, you're happy with it, great. If you're not sure, get a second, third, fourth, fifth opinion. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just a matter of how much time and effort you want to spend.
Do you ever work with auction houses, auction houses that you auction rare books?
Well, there are auction houses that auction rare books. That can be good. It depends on, what the book is.
Do you ever get into that world?
We do occasionally. We get into it. But when you get into some of the auction houses, for instance, Sotheby's, Christie's, if you have a single item and it's under $5,000, they don't even want to consider it. And even at $5,000, if you have a huge library that has things that are worth hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, yeah, they'll do the whole thing. But generally, auction houses are higher. The first book I have here is Following the Equator. It's by Mark Twain. It's 1897 Hartford, and it's a little bit used. I guess it came in for the book sale. It's a little bit worn and used. It is a first edition. One of the things about first editions with authors, especially popular authors, it's almost always the first book or two that they wrote that are the rarest. And the reason for that is, first of all, when an author comes out with a new book and it's their first book, usually the printing run is relatively small because publishers don't, they don't have a track record. Also, nobody's paying attention usually to the first books, so therefore they don't get saved. This was one of his later popular books. I mean, he started writing in the earlier 1800s. He was very, very popular. He came out in huge numbers, and other than in mint condition, and I mean absolutely mint, the book doesn't get a great price. This one would probably get $25, $35. Now, the reason I asked for this, and I also have one here, before they had dust jackets on books, or dust jackets go back to the 1830s and 40s, but dust jackets as we know them started around World War I, and they used to have decorative covers. And the reason they'd have decorative covers, the publisher figured that if they caught your eye when you walked in the bookstore, more chance you'd buy them. I'm going to just set this one here. And you can go to yard sales, book sales, library sales, and buy a lot of these books with decorative covers relatively cheaply. There are some that are expensive, and individually they might not seem like much, but as a collection they can be graphically quite interesting. And matter of fact, I have a collection like this myself that started off as a bit of a joke. I got a book, had a picture of a toilet on the cover. The title of the book was Flushed with Pride, The Life of Thomas Crapper. Invented the toilet. In any case, I brought it home, I showed it to my wife, she took one look at it and said, we have to put this in the bathroom. So we did. A couple of days later, I got another book and it had a big eye staring out of the cover. The title was We Never Sleep. It was a history of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, but with a big eye staring at you. I thought, put that in the bathroom too. Now this is a little half bathroom, so there's no shower, no steam. Next thing you know, we built bookshelves, and now we have 300 or 400 of these Victorian style illustrated books in the bathroom. People walk in, they're a little taken aback. Loads and loads of reading material. And one of the rules of the collection is that nothing can be valuable, because every once in a while a book will fall off the shelf, and you can imagine where it ends up. I like to end the talk talking about Bibles, and one of the reasons I like to do that is the Bible is the most commonly printed book of all time, always has been, probably always will be, and we sometimes get 5 and 10 calls a week with people who have 100, 200-year-old family Bibles, and in almost all cases, we have to say to the people, if this is your family Bible and it's been handed down through the generations, sentimentally it's priceless, but monetarily it might not be worth that much. Now there are exceptions, so it's always worth checking. There's the Gutenberg Bible, there's others. And sometimes these big Victorian Bibles with the beautiful leather bindings and the clasp, if they're in mint condition, they can be $100, $200, $300 because they make a wonderful gift for a minister, priest, divinity student. But break one clasp, have one hinge go, they lose all that value. Now sometimes also those big Bibles in the front, back, middle have births, deaths, marriages and so on. Those can be invaluable to the local historical or genealogical society, but they might only want to Xerox out the title page, the page with the information. They don't want the whole Bible. And one of the things, a little aside, that I do is I hope people watch Antiques Roadshow, but I appraise for Antiques Roadshow, and I've done that for years. And it's a lot of fun. It's a great way to see the country. And the way that show works is they usually do it at a convention center, although now the next season they're going to be doing it at mansions and smaller venues and some outdoor. But they do it, usually have done it at a convention center. They do it on a Saturday. You appraise from 7:30 in the morning, sometimes till 7:30, 8 at night, almost nonstop. About 5,000 people come to a show. Each person brings 2 items, so there's about 10,000 items that come in. They tape around 50 to 70 items, and that's what makes up about 3 hours of TV for 3 shows. Now, being an appraiser, you have to be there a little before 7:30. And I remember one of the shows, there are 3 book appraisers, and we're sitting next to the music, next to jewelry, around in a big circle. But we were saying to ourselves, I wonder how many Bibles we'll see today. So we counted. 75 in one city, in one area, 75 Bibles. Now sometimes, depending on who the other appraisers are, we have a little pool going and so on. But one last story about Bibles. I got called to a large old church in Boston, well over a 100-year-old church. They had a huge library, and they just wanted me in to see if over the years they had accumulated any books that were valuable. And I spent a day there. They actually had some really good books. It was a lot of fun. At the end of the day, the priest said to me, could you come down the basement? There are a few more books. I went down the basement. And then there was a small closet or room. It was sort of just in that area, not as high as ceiling. The priest opened the door, front to back, floor to ceiling, top to bottom. It was stuffed with thousands of old Bibles. And I looked at the priest and I said, what is this? And he says, well, people hate to throw away a book. They feel it's sacrilegious to throw away a Bible. So what happens when a parishioner dies and the family doesn't want the Bible? They come and they present it to the church. And he says, what do? We very graciously accept it. We don't want to offend anybody. Then we go downstairs, open the door, throw it in with the rest of them. And he says, and we can't drive a dumpster up to the back of the church and fill it full of Bibles. That just wouldn't be right. So I use it as an example to say that if you want to give something to a charity, ask them if they want it first. If they want it and can use it, it's great. But if not, all you're doing is you're really not doing anyone a favor. I'll finish by just saying that don't ever feel that you're bothering myself, the people I work with. We'd rather have 100 people call with nothing special than to have the 100th person call 100 first-person call and say, I just threw away a Tamerlane. Now, the way I do the appraisals here is I'm going to end the formal part of the talk. I don't do them to everybody. I just do them in sort of a crowd scene. If you want to stand over my shoulder, hear what I'm saying, that's fine. But any type of order I've found slows things down tremendously. If anybody has a big stack of books they want done, I will do them all. But if there are people waiting behind you, I might only do 1 or 2 and then ask you to go to the end of the line and so on. It's not fair. So in any case, what I'll say is thank you very much, and then just bring things up and crowd around and we'll do it. And thank you. Literally, just bring things up and come and